Morning, everyone. This is a continuation of our episode 17, Famous Quotes About Paul, involving Robert Eisenman. We've done part one, where we began reviewing his life, background, and also particularly one of his more recent books. So in part two, we'll give you a brief overview of his background, and then we'll jump back into the book review we were doing in part one. Before that, I just want to emphasize what I think is important about this particular part, or this particular episode 17. That is this. I asked this sub question as you're listening to what we're revealing and you really absorb the impact. Keep asking yourself the question: are Eisenman's Dead Sea Scrolls discoveries about the spouter of lies in the Habakkuk Pesher, is it a finding which is the most key religious discovery, one of the most key religious discoveries of all time? And you'll have to decide that for yourself. I think unquestionably it is, when you really face the impact of what it's talking about. In other words, it's going to confirm when Ambrose, Bishop Ambrose, we recently told you in a book he wrote in the 350s, used to said matter of factly that this whole incident over Paul dressing down Peter led to a scandal within the church, and the 12 apostles concluded Paul was a false apostle and he was teaching erroneously about circumcision and Sabbath. And that's in Bishop Ambrose's own words in his commentary to 1 Corinthians 9, verse 2. You can even see it in Bray's recent translation from the year 2006. And you'll see it also. I did an online translation of it. And so we will now jump into this. But keep this question in mind. Now, here's the book we commented on. Well, after doing his biography, we brought you to here to tell you about this book, his latest book from 2018. It's called James the Just in the Habakkuk Pesher, and it's only $2.99 on Kindle. I got it immediately on all my devices by pressing that. It was just great. Or if you want to have it for yourself or to give it away, it's $9.99. And so he basically pulls out his proofs that James the Just is the person speaking in the Habakkuk Pesher for most of it, and then he's killed at a certain point in time. There's 2 volumes to this work, and so he's dead, but at a certain point. But the commentary continues, and the group basically consolidates its views about the spouter of lies in this work. And he's going to identify this as the New Testament church because it's about a group that, as he mentioned in prior books, he's said they believed there was a Messiah who was killed by the priests of Jerusalem, and he ascended, or excuse me, he's in heaven. And now it's a new covenant community going forward. It's known as the Way. It's led by a person named the Zadik, or Righteous One. James the Justice was said to be only known by his moniker, meaning the name the Just One, the Zadik in Hebrew. So it exactly matches all of those circumstances. And then you have a spouter of lies who's teaching people not to follow the law. And you're going to see that this same spouter of lies makes a big deal about Habakkuk, the prophet Habakkuk, in the Law and Prophets, in the prophet section. And that statement there is in Hebrew, it says the just shall live by faithfulness or obedience, emunah in Hebrew, but this person, that spout of lies, is saying it means by faith and that you don't need works. So, I mean, and this is determined to be by scholars paleontologically as a first century AD work. So even though it's in the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is one of those works that are from the first century AD. Another one was the Damascus document that was found in the late 1800s, was already determined to be a first century work in the period of time of the Christians. And in fact, it was called a work by the Christians of Syria because it was found in Syria. They assumed that was who the group was. But it turned out this has now been found in the Dead Sea Scrolls too. So you have another work that's from the first century AD. So before the time, in the time of Christ. And both works are estimated to be around 50 AD. So before the temple's fall. Okay, so that's an introduction to the work we were reviewing last time. Just want to review just briefly Eisenman's background. I'll read the ones I highlight in yellow. If you want to see the full biography, go to the prior episode. Eisenman is a professor emeritus of Middle East religions and archaeology and Islamic law, and the director of the Institute for the Study of Judeo-Christian Origins at California State University, Long Beach. He has a PhD in Middle East languages and cultures with a specialty in Islamic law from Columbia University. He holds a Master of Arts degree from New York University in Hebrew and Near East Studies. He's written a couple of books I want to highlight that we have focused on in the past. James, the Brother of Jesus. This was his foundational work back in 1997 that showed that basically the same thing you're seeing here in the Habakkuk Pesher, but you're talking about a 1,000-page book. And in the past, I've had to tell people, well, go look at this book, James the Just, James the Brother of Jesus, and it's so long. This book is 154 pages. The one we're talking about here, this one is 154 pages. And finally, he's done it in a synopsis that is easy to digest, easy to share, and easy to find because that's all the book's about. And then he did an article that he's made available free online called Paul as an Herodian, and we are beginning to do more work on that because we're the evidence he's brought forth seems corroborated in many ways. So we'll get into that, and that can change fundamentally how we even explain Paul. But we haven't gotten there yet. We haven't done a full review of that possibility yet. We're getting there. Next, we'll show you the slide where we left off which is at page 8, and what the last point that Eisenman was making is that when we look at the Habakkuk Pesher, we see a commentary on Habakkuk 2, verse 4. The spouter of lies takes the position that faith alone is what brings salvation, freedom from judgment, and the author, the Tzaddik of this text in the original Hebrew in the Dead Sea Scrolls is about the true exegesis of Habakkuk 2:4. It says in Hebrew, the just shall live by his emunah, faithfulness or obedience, similar synonyms, and totally at odds and in contrast to the one who teaches its faith alone without works. Now we'll begin part 2. Okay, so here we read the eschatological sense of the Habakkuk 2, verse 4 Pesher. The Habakkuk Pesher means the commentary called Habakkuk Pesher in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where it says the words, quote, saved from the bit ha-mishpat, has escaped many commentators. What is he talking about? What is a beit ha-mishpat? Well, explains that here later in another page 39. He says the usage beit ha-mishpat, which Verms and other commentators translate quite prosaically as house of judgment. So to be saved, go back here to this other prior paragraph up here. So when the Habakkuk Pesher in the Dead Sea Scrolls is talking about being saved from the Beit HaMishpat, it's talking about being saved, how you get saved from the house of judgment. Now then Eisenman brings it home when he says in the Hebrew of the Habakkuk Pesher, Dead Sea Scrolls, it talks about Yazalem, he saves them. Therefore, it takes on a completely different sense. So what he's saying is that we're looking at salvation, going to heaven, that kind of thing, not just being judged, being sent to heaven, sent to salvation, is contingent on a correct understanding of what the words in Habakkuk 2, verse 4 says. Is it you're saved by your emunah, your steadfastness towards God, your fidelity, your obedience, or is it just by faith alone, which is the reading of the spouter of lies that the Habakkuk Pesher is trying to refute? Now, I want to move on to another issue here. He then mentions, I'm going to stop there for a minute. I'm going to tell you a few of his parallels that after I got to the end of doing this synthesis for all of you, showing you some of the key quotes, I realized he was making some key points that need to be lifted out of the general synopsis and put into a category which I would call parallels. All right, so what we have in the first parallel is we have a new covenant community. They're believing a Messiah's already come, he's died, he's departed. That's in Eisenman has explained that in prior books, and so he hasn't repeated that in this book particularly, but I'm just pulling that together because he's going to reference it here. And this community has authored this Habakkuk Pesher, and this community points at Isaiah 53:11. Okay, and he's telling you that means the Ebion who wrote this work, they're referenced in chapter 3 of Habakkuk Pesher commentary, they are identifying themselves as Messianic. So by referencing this character, this figure, this dying Messiah, even, by the way, Eisenman, even though he's Jewish, he's not following Tobias Singer's view, which is you just disregard. There's this dying and suffering person who's taking on the atonement of the world. No, he's acknowledging that is a Messiah figure in Isaiah 53. So just so you know, he has a pro Jesus view in that sense. People question whether he's pro Jesus 100%. Well, he questions whether Jesus says sometimes words are put in his mouth about, pay your taxes, and he thinks Herodians might have corrected our scripture. But he is very normative about who Jesus was and who he claimed to be and who people thought he was. So I just want to make that point. And so he's bringing this out for our benefit, and actually, I think, to push back against even Jewish theologians who've been trying to say, oh, the Isaiah 53 doesn't mean anything. No, he sees exactly what it means. So let me read this to you. So it starts off, he talks about the revelation of a saving knowledge. Okay. So there is some aspect of knowledge of Christ that can impart salvation. If you think he's the Messiah, you think he's the prophet, you're going to turn in obedience to him. And that's another key factor. But he goes on. He says the word da'at invokes a fundamental concept at Qumran. We have already signaled its relationship to the vocabulary and ideology of Isaiah 53, verse 11, when taken according to its literal sense, not in its superficial one, i.e., through the amal of his soul and by his knowledge. Now, amal, he translates in other places as works, of the works of his soul and by his knowledge. So by the fusion of knowledge and works, faith and works, you have reached this correct point. And then it says, and this is how it's being read. The Habakkuk Pesher is reading Isaiah 53:11 about the suffering servant, that by knowing the suffering of his soul, the suffering servant, and by his knowledge, he will be my servant, the righteous one, who will justify many. So he himself, by his works of his soul, the suffering of his soul, and by his knowledge, will my servant, the righteous one, justify many. So you see, Eisenman is bringing out a parallel. This is not just a normal Jewish group that has no idea of a Messiah having come. This is a group trying to say the Messiah has come, and this is what he's given us as a model of how to uh, to be justified. He was justified in this way by his amal, the works of his soul, and by his knowledge will my servant, the righteous one, justify many. And so he's going to impart these works and his knowledge, his message, his teaching, his Torah to us, and that's how we will. He's justifying us by giving us that message that we then obey. The second parallel, he says, this is just it's a small point. It's seemingly a small point, but it's a very big point when you look at it. He mentions something about a contamination is mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls by this community, the New Covenant community, who's waiting for the Messiah to come back. They're contaminated. They would be contaminated by taking gifts from pagan practicing Gentiles. And the Habakkuk Pesher, in line with 3 John 1:7, we find this exactly a parallel. Now let's listen to what Eisenman wrote. Okay, he said the priests, according to the Habakkuk Pesher, have polluted the temple by associating with and accepting gifts or sacrifices from such classes of persons, i.e., the rich, and he interprets that to mean the Herodians and other foreigners or people in touch with such persons. And this is what he calls the problem of the pollution of the temple treasure. All right, now read. So what does that mean? If you take money from Gentiles, you are potentially allowing yourself to accept gifts or sacrifices that will pollute the treasure that you have in your hand. Now, we are all Gentiles, right? So what would we understand is today? We're all the righteous Gentiles, right? We're all the good Gentiles because we've been justified by faith. That's what we're told. But that's not what this church is saying is true. That the people who are Gentiles who don't get justified in the way that the Messiah can justify you through his amal, his the works, and his knowledge that he's imparting to you, you won't be saved. And so those people who don't follow Christ truly are still in the pagan category. Sorry if that includes you, but that's what this is. I'm just giving you the perspective of this group as Eisenman, as an expert, is extracted to show you, and I'm showing you what he's saying. But now I want to show you he didn't even notice this. There's a complete parallel between Apostle John in his writings in 3 John 7:1-7. Listen to what he says. I'll read it in the King James here first at the bottom. Because that for his namesake they went forth, meaning the prior verse is about missionaries of the church went out from Jerusalem to the Gentiles, but they refused to do something. They went forth taking nothing of the Gentiles. Now, by the way, that is completely at odds the way Paul operates. He is taking gifts and all kinds of things for the Gentiles. And the church at Jerusalem would be offended by doing that. Don't give us any of that money. We don't want any of that money. Please, please. So there is a complete parallel between the Dead Sea Scrolls community, known as the Ebyon, who believe a Messiah has come, who are disputing with a spouter of lies, who claims the Habakkuk Pesher means you're saved by faith alone, and they believe the faith that works is what is necessary. This same group has the same message of Apostle John in 3 John 1:7, and Eisenman mentions it here, but doesn't even correlate it. Maybe he doesn't, he just didn't correlate it. I'm correlating it, and maybe I'll send this video for him to think about in the future. Anyway, just another parallel number 2. Let's go to parallel number 3. And I noticed this when I read the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I don't know if any of you did. This was already in the Dead Sea Scrolls that were revealed during the period of the Catholic period, but because they were so effective in erasing any connection to the Evian and obscuring it, none of us would have thought. I thought it was just a coincidence that there was a council of 12 ruling the community, but no, Eisman saying no. This is R12. This is R12. It's right there, and he's right because there is no other example in Judaism where there was a council of 12 except in the Christian movement. So let's read what he says. And this is in footnote 16 of his work at page 125. You see up here on the right at 125. The illusion meaning a reference, indirect reference to something called the Jerusalem Council, has grown up surrounding the confrontation between Paul and the Jerusalem church leadership concerning both the advisability and terms of reference of the Gentile mission. He says, see Galatians 2 and Acts 15. Certainly, and I believe he's referring here to the Habakkuk Pesher, not sure, 1QS at 8.1 refers to a central council of the community, which appears made up of 12 members, of whom 3 are priests. Now, this is so interesting, and I'm going to pause there. So, the central rulership is known as the council, and the council has 12 members. Then it refers to 3 priests, and he says, it could also be 3 priests are added, so it could be 12 plus 3. The sense here is tantalizingly obscure, but the dichotomy of priestly and Israelite imagery which follows suggests, quote, the 3 are part and parcel of the 12, not added to it as majority scholarship generally thinks. Now, you might say, well, James is the odd man out. That makes him 13. But if you really pay attention, there's another James, James, son of Zebedee, who dies in Acts, I think it's Acts 11, or murdered, I should say. So actually, of the original 12, that included Matthias being picked by Jesus by lots in Acts 1, and then James acting as the bishop. And if you study the Gospel of Thomas, that the story was an account, and that's even repeated elsewhere in other works, ancient works, that James was selected by Jesus to guide them forward, the 12 forward, or the 11 at that time, the 11 forward. Jesus telling them after his ascension, follow James. So James, at the point of about 50 AD, would have been number 12 if you figure it out. And there are 3 pillars that Paul in Galatians 2 refers to. One is Bishop James, who he thinks is an apostle but isn't. And he calls him James, the brother of the Lord, okay, in Galatians 2. And then the other 2 pillars are actual apostles. That's Peter and John. So Peter, John, and James, the brother of Jesus, are all referenced as 3 pillars of the Jerusalem church, of the Jerusalem apostles. So you see, that's how you get a direct correlation between what we see in Acts, put it around Acts 15, put it around Acts 21. In Acts 15 to 21 period, you have 12 ruling, 11 surviving apostles, one who is not an apostle, but a brother of Jesus, who was appointed by Jesus to be the bishop or the guide of the group going forward. And then it goes on here. The sense here is analyzing of the obscure, but the dichotomy of priestly and Israelite imagery which follows suggests the three are part and parcel of the 12, not added to as majority scholarship generally thinks. So majority thinks it's 12 plus 3, but he's saying it's worded obscurely enough that it really could be 3 within the 12. And that's exactly what you see in the book of Acts from chapter 15 after the death of James, the son of Zebedee. And the word priest there shouldn't put you off, is because he explains later that they had a sense that their mission was to be righteous like priests. These 12. Okay, let's move on to 12, parallel number. Okay, now here is his citation in footnote 24. I don't see 24 over here, page 130. So it's a footnote, and he's talking about recognitions, Clementine recognitions 1.70. And he mentions this in reference to the following heading. Let me give you this heading, my heading. The Clementine recognitions 1.70 of the Ebionites refers to Paul as the enemy. Okay, so the Clementine recognitions, everybody agrees the Ebionite Church is a producer of this work. Originally, Rufinus translated into Latin and just so happened to destroy every possible copy there could exist in the kingdom, the Roman Empire, and did a good job on it. It didn't survive, except many years, centuries later, it was found in the dust, and we have them, thankfully. But they are all in Rufinus's Latin, and we don't have the original texts that were involved. So there is that issue. You have to interpret what's it about. But anyway, the person who the Clementine recognitions calls Simon Magus isn't really Paul. All the scholars agree that that is Rufinus's simplistic change to protect the church from the message of the Clementine homilies and the message of the Ebionites. Let's just change the name Paul to Simon Magus, and we'll destroy all the original texts, and nobody will be able to prove otherwise. But we'll know if we ever want to know what was really going on. So now let's read, with that in mind, what Eisman says. We have already pointed out in passing Paul's perhaps inadvertent application of such a vocabulary, enemy, to himself in Galatians 4, verse 16. Also, take a look at the parallel passages in James 4, verse 4, and Matthew 13, verse 25's parable of the tares, where, quote, the enemy, who can be none other than Paul, sows the evil tares and is finally identified as the devil. And so I want you to show you, he doesn't realize it, but I take what Jesus is saying is prophetic. That's not something that was added after the church wanted to make Paul look bad. The wheat and the tares is talking about someone who sows an enemy who sows tares. They look very much like the wheat, but they're not true wheat. They're tares. They're just similar looking. So the followers of Paul are not true followers of Christ. They are followers of Paul, the enemy. And that's prophesied by Jesus. That's not a statement of Jesus after he's after, this is not put in Jesus' mouth by Matthew later, in my opinion. Okay. So Jesus has that prophetic ability and he can say these things. But what Eisenman's saying is it's a parallel because he's assuming that the Ebionite modified the book of Matthew to reflect these values, these truths. All right, so then Eisenman shows a parallel, what I call parallel number 5, that Paul is very self-aware he is called a liar, and that is paralleling a frequent statement in the Habakkuk Pesher that they're battling the spouter of lies. He has a lying spirit, and so on. So this is uh, a major valid point. Like you have all these other lineups, the 12, the Messiah came, and we're waiting for him. The high priest killed the Messiah. We're waiting for him to come back. We're a new covenant community. We teach the way. I mean, all these coincidences, they keep adding up. They keep piling up, and this is a very important one. So let's listen to what he says at page 130 of his work in a footnote. Paul over and over again shows his concern over the lying accusation, and that he'll usually say, I'm not lying, I'm not lying, I'm not lying. This is in Romans 3, verse 7, Romans 9, 1, 2 Corinthians 11, verse 31. How many is that now? 3. Galatians 1:20, 4. 1 Timothy 2:7, 5. So 5 times he said, I'm not lying. I swear I'm not lying. Then he says, compare this. So it ends here. Then this is the start of a new sentence. Okay. And before I read all these verses off, I want you to know where we're going. It says, these verses show the lying terminology was known to other authorities in the New Testament. And then I'll go on there. So let's look at the verses. He says, show this lying terminology was used about an opponent or opposition. 1 John 1, verse 6, 1 John 1, verse 10, 1 John chapter 2, verse 4, 1 John 2, verse 21. How many times so far? Wow. 1 John 4, verse 20, and 1 John 5, 110. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 references by Apostle John to a person or a force of lying. And what does it lie about? Show the lying terminology was known to other authors in the New Testament. 1 John 2, verse 4 even places in conjunction the liar type with the activity of what? Quote, not keeping the commandments. If you don't keep the commandments, you're a liar. Okay, so if you claim you're a Christian and you don't keep the commandments, you're lying. You're lying to yourself. You're lying to God. Just, I'm be honest with you. That's what Apostle John tells you if that's you. James 3, verse 14 includes an allusion to, quote, truth, provides the evidence that this kind of terminology, liar, was applied to at least one of its ideological opponents. So you have another reference, James, John. Okay, so now the next passage after that is back to our review of quotes from the book James, the Just in Habakkuk Pesher. Since we're at minute 26, 27, I'm going to stop here and we'll pick up in the next episode with the quotes there. But I hope you enjoyed the parallels I showed you. They're very striking, and we'll continue to show you what he actually calls very striking references that are in common between the Habakkuk Pesher and what we can see in the very New Testament work in front of your face. So it's something you can validate. You can verify yourself by just knowing the words in the New Testament, including the words by Paul. All right. God bless everybody. Ciao.